The Lone Ranger was one of the first heroes of the new medium.
The cowboy will always be the symbol of the American heritage, the fair play, the honest, the good guy, and the white.
That trumpet. You already heard it in your head just now, didn't you? The second anyone mentions the Lone Ranger, that fanfare from the William Tell Overture just fires somewhere deep in your brain like a reflex you never asked for. That's not an accident. That's decades of cultural conditioning doing exactly what it was designed to do. But here's the thing. Almost everything you think you know about the Lone Ranger, it's either half the story or the cleaned-up version. The real story behind 221 episodes, a masked hero, a loyal companion, and one of the most complicated franchises in American entertainment history is so much messier, stranger, and honestly more fascinating than the legend. Today, we're counting down 21 weird facts you didn't know about the Lone Ranger. And I promise, by the time we hit number 1, you're going to look at that mask completely differently. Let's ride. Fact 21. It wasn't born on television. Let's start by blowing up a myth that most people carry around without even realizing it. When the Lone Ranger debuted on television screens in 1949, millions of families gathered around their sets thinking they were watching something brand new. They weren't.
You look as though you'd be right handy toting a gun.
I can use one when I have to.
Did you ever hear of the Madden Gang?
Madden Gang.
The Lone Ranger had already been alive for 16 years. 16. The character was created for radio back in 1933 by a Detroit broadcaster named George W. Trendle, who co-owned a station called WXYZ. He needed content. Simple as that. He sat down with writer Fran Stryker, and together they built this masked Texas Ranger, who rides the frontier righting wrongs and then disappears before anyone can thank him. The 1949 television version wasn't a new idea. It was a promotion. Same mythology, same moral code, same William Tell Overture, just a new medium. And it worked better than anyone had a right to expect. Which raises the question, if the foundation was already 16 years old, why did it feel so fresh? The answer involves decisions, accidents, and one actor who couldn't separate himself from a mask even when the courts told him to. Fact 20. Clayton Moore almost didn't get the role. Here's where things get interesting. When producers sat down to cast the TV version, Clayton Moore was not the obvious choice. He was a working actor. Serials, westerns, the kind of solid but unspectacular career that Hollywood was full of in the late 1940s. Several other actors were seriously considered before anyone landed on Moore. And even after he got the part, it took time. Early episodes show an actor finding his footing, not yet fully inhabiting the legend. But then, something shifted. Moore didn't just play the Lone Ranger. He became him, absorbed him. For the rest of his life, decades after the show ended, Clayton Moore wore the mask at public appearances, answered fan letters in character, and carried himself like a man with a genuine moral obligation. The role stopped being a job somewhere along the way and became something closer to a calling. That dedication is either deeply inspiring or a little heartbreaking, depending on what you know about what came later. And you should probably keep that in mind as we go. Fact 19. Tonto almost wasn't Native American. Let's talk about something the franchise doesn't advertise. Early in the development of the character, there were genuine discussions about making Tonto something entirely different, including a Mexican vaquero type rather than a Native American companion. The decision that eventually settled things was a combination of frontier authenticity and the fact that the radio version had already established Tonto as indigenous. And then Jay Silverheels walked into the picture. Silverheels was Mohawk, a former lacrosse star and professional boxer, who brought something to the role that no amount of writing could manufacture: authority. He was one of the first indigenous actors in a major recurring television role in American history, in 1949, on network television. Now, the characterization of Tonto is complicated by modern standards. We're not going to pretend otherwise, but within the limitations of that era, Silverheels was doing something genuinely groundbreaking, and he knew it, which brings us to the next fact. Fact 18. Jay Silverheels had to fight for basic respect on set. Behind the scenes, the story was not as clean as what appeared on screen. Silverheels pushed back, quietly, persistently, and effectively. He objected to dialogue he found demeaning. He advocated for Tonto to be treated with dignity rather than used purely as comic foil. And because he was also a former professional boxer, nobody was lining up to argue with him too aggressively.
You don't know, but you follow me. Jim wants to talk to you about Judge Knox's killing.
Bet he does, all right.
Years later, he became the first indigenous person to receive a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. He didn't just perform in that show, he fought for the integrity of what that show could be. That matters. Remember that the next time someone reduces Tonto to a punchline. Fact 17. The silver bullets weren't just a cool detail. Here's one that changes how you watch every single episode once you know it. Why does the Lone Ranger use silver bullets? Most people assume it's just an aesthetic choice, something that makes the character feel unique and memorable. But there's actual mythology behind it, built deliberately into the original backstory by writer Fran Stryker. The Lone Ranger made his bullets from silver as a reminder, a physical, constant reminder that life is precious and that a bullet should only be fired when there is absolutely no other option. He never kills anyone, just disarms them. The moral code wasn't something he talked about. He carried it, literally, in his ammunition. For a kid's show from 1949, that is a remarkably sophisticated piece of storytelling embedded in what most people just remember as a cool Western prop. Fact 16. The production pace was genuinely insane. Quick question, how long do you think it takes to shoot a full episode of television? A week? 2 weeks? More? Try 3 days. The Lone Ranger operated on a production timeline that would make modern TV writers genuinely weep. 3 days per episode, start to finish, with outdoor locations, horses, stunts, and the full cast and crew. The team became so efficient that they would occasionally finish early, at which point the producer's solution was not to go home early but to add scenes. Not because the story needed them, because they had time and needed to hit their running length. Some of those scenes are exactly as awkward as you'd expect, but there's also something almost charming about the spontaneity of it when you watch them now. You can feel the pressure and the energy and the barely controlled chaos underneath every episode. Fact 15. Silver the Horse had his own fan mail. Yes, really. The horse received actual letters. Silver wasn't just a vehicle for the hero. Silver was a character, complete with fans who wrote personal correspondence addressed directly to the animal. The volume was significant enough that it became a legitimate production concern. Someone had to manage the horse's correspondence. Now here's the detail that makes this stranger. The horse you saw as Silver throughout the series wasn't always the same horse. Multiple animals played Silver over the run of the show. The studio was meticulous about never publicly revealing which horse was which, because they wanted children to believe it was always the same faithful companion. Is that sweet? Or is it slightly manipulative? Maybe both. It depends on how you feel about the nature of illusion in entertainment, which, if you're watching a show about a man who hides his identity, is maybe a fitting question to sit with. Fact 14. The mask origin story kept changing. You'd think the most iconic visual element of the entire franchise would have a locked-down, consistent backstory. You'd be wrong. The explanation for why the Lone Ranger wears the mask shifted and morphed across radio, television, and print adaptations more than once.
You've just never been given the chance to prove it.
And you think Morty will let me wear the pants in the family if I do?
She'll have to.
The core idea stayed stable. He's the sole survivor of an ambush on a group of Texas Rangers, and he takes on a secret identity to pursue the outlaws responsible. But the specific details around the mask itself kept getting reworked. The TV show eventually landed on a version where the mask was made from the fabric of his dead brother's vest. Let that sit for a second. Every time this man put on that mask, he was wearing a piece of his brother's clothing. The brother he watched die on a kid's show on Saturday morning. That's not just dark. That's genuinely affecting once you know what you're looking at. Fact 13. A legal battle froze the entire franchise. Remember when I said to keep Clayton Moore's dedication in mind? Here's why. In the late 1970s, the company that owned the Lone Ranger property went to war with Moore over his public appearances in character. They filed a legal injunction preventing him from wearing the mask at personal events. The man who had spent decades living by the character's moral code, who had become functionally inseparable from the role in the public imagination, was court-ordered to stop wearing the mask. His response? He switched to large dark sunglasses, in public, as a protest. That image, Clayton Moore in sunglasses, still in costume, still showing up for fans, is one of the more quietly devastating images in American entertainment history if you understand the context. The injunction was eventually lifted, but some things, once broken, don't fully repair. Fact 12. The man who owned the character was notoriously tight with money. George Trendle built a fortune off the Lone Ranger. Radio, television, merchandise, comics, licensing. The revenue was enormous. The people who actually created the content? Less so. Fran Stryker, the writer who penned thousands of radio scripts and essentially constructed the entire mythology from the ground up, was paid a flat rate with zero royalties. Clayton Moore's contract disputes were rooted in the same dynamic. Trendle understood the business with ruthless clarity. He knew what he had, and he knew exactly how to monetize it. Whether you find that admirable or exploitative probably depends on which side of the contract you'd be sitting on. It's worth asking, though, how many of the things we celebrate in pop culture were built on labor that was never properly compensated? Fact 11. The show basically saved a BC. Here is a piece of television history that almost nobody talks about outside of industry circles. When The Lone Ranger premiered on television in 1949, ABC was the weakest of the three major networks, a distant struggling third behind CBS and NBC, with uncertain futures and skeptical advertisers. The Lone Ranger was one of ABC's first genuine hits. It delivered ratings and credibility at exactly the moment the network needed both to survive. Without it, ABC's early history looks dramatically different. And if ABC's early history looks different, then everything that comes after, every show, every franchise, every moment of television that aired on that network, becomes uncertain. The Lone Ranger didn't just entertain kids. It quietly helped shape the entire structure of American broadcasting. That's a legacy that deserves far more recognition than it gets. Fact 10. The theme music had nothing to do with The Lone Ranger. The William Tell Overture was composed by Gioacchino Rossini in 1829 for an opera about Swiss independence. It has nothing whatsoever to do with Texas Rangers, frontier justice, silver bullets, or masked vigilantes of any kind. Radio producers grabbed it in 1933 because it was dramatic. It had that perfect galloping rhythm in the finale. And, crucially, it was public domain, free to use. No licensing fees. That's it. That's the whole story. One of the most recognizable theme music associations in American cultural history was a budget decision. By the mid-20th century, if you played the William Tell Overture for an American child, they would think of the Lone Ranger before they ever thought of Switzerland. Rossini almost certainly had no idea what those final notes would eventually mean to an entirely different country more than a century after his death. Fact 9. There was a brief, deeply uncomfortable recast. In 1952, during a contract dispute, Clayton Moore walked off the show, and the producers replaced him. An actor named John Hart stepped into the role and played the Lone Ranger for a season and a half. Hart was a capable actor who did solid professional work. The problem was that audiences immediately noticed the switch, and they were not happy about it. Something was off. The specific quality that Moore had brought to the character, that particular blend of dignity and quiet intensity, wasn't easily replicated. The episodes featuring Hart aren't always clearly labeled in reruns, which has created decades of quiet confusion for viewers who couldn't quite identify why something felt different. Moore eventually returned. The Hart era faded into trivia territory, but it's a reminder that some things, some combinations of person, role, and moment, are genuinely irreplaceable. Fact 8. The character may have been inspired by a real person. This one is debated, but the case is compelling enough that serious historians have made it. Bass Reeves was a black U.S. deputy marshal who operated in the Oklahoma and Arkansas territories in the late 1800s, a former enslaved person who became one of the most effective and celebrated lawmen on the frontier. He was known for disguising himself to infiltrate outlaw gangs and capture fugitives. He reportedly carried silver dollars as a personal calling card. The parallels to the Lone Ranger mythology are significant. A lone lawman operating outside conventional systems, disguises as a primary tool, a specific silver motif as a signature. Trendle and Stryker never confirmed the connection, but the overlap is too substantial to dismiss casually. Whether it was intentional inspiration or remarkable coincidence, Bass Reeves deserves to be part of the Lone Ranger conversation. Fact 7. The Moral Code was an actual written document. This wasn't vibes. This wasn't a general creative direction. This was policy. The producers maintained a formal written code of conduct governing how the Lone Ranger could behave across every medium simultaneously: radio, television, comics, merchandise, everything. The rules were specific. He could not shoot to kill. He could not drink alcohol. He had to speak with correct grammar at all times. No romantic storylines. He had to be demonstrably kind to children and animals. Go back and watch an episode now with that knowledge. The formality of his speech in casual moments suddenly makes complete sense. The producers weren't being stiff. They were enforcing a standard. In 1949, with millions of children watching, they felt genuinely responsible for what those children were seeing. Whatever you think of that era's television, that particular seriousness of purpose is worth acknowledging. Fact 6. The merchandise operation was a template for modern entertainment. The Lone Ranger franchise in the 1950s wasn't just selling a show, it was selling a world. Lunchboxes, cap guns, cowboy hats, toy horses, comic books, breakfast cereals, school supplies. The character was embedded into the daily physical lives of American children in ways that went far beyond the television set. This was one of the earliest full-scale examples of what we now call franchise merchandising, the kind of cradle-to-grave product integration that Disney later perfected and that currently drives every major entertainment property on Earth. You can draw a direct line from a 1950s Lone Ranger cap gun to the current state of superhero merchandise. It's not even a long line. The template was laid down by a masked man on a white horse more than 70 years ago. Fact 5. Clayton Moore was deeply method before. Method acting was a thing. Moore gave up drinking during the run of the show. He read and responded thoughtfully to children's fan letters. He refused to break character at public appearances in ways that might disappoint kids. He carried himself, offset, like a man who genuinely believed in the Lone Ranger's code.
What are you talking about? That's Bob Walker.
For once, you're right. That is Bob Walker.
This was decades before anyone used the term method acting in a mainstream context. Moore was doing something that had no name yet, fully internalizing a character as a way of life rather than a performance, which is why that legal battle over the mask hits differently when you understand it. It wasn't just a business dispute. They were asking a man to take off something that had become part of his identity, and he showed up in sunglasses to make sure nobody missed the point. Fact 4. The show quietly tackled social issues. For a Western on American television in the early 1950s, The Lone Ranger was progressive in ways that the marketing never led with. There were episodes dealing with racial prejudice, episodes where the primary villain was a corrupt businessman rather than a conventional outlaw, episodes where indigenous characters were written with complexity that was genuinely unusual for the period. None of it was perfect. Tonto's overall characterization remains complicated no matter how you frame it, but deliberate choices were made repeatedly to push back against the more casual prejudices of the era. For a children's show on a struggling network in 1949, that required something. Not exactly courage, but intention. And intention in the right direction, consistently applied, actually adds up to something, over time. Fact 3. The 1956 film changed how people pictured the mythology. At peak popularity, they brought The Lone Ranger to theaters, and this time, they did it in color. The 1956 film wasn't a cash grab. It had a real budget, a wide release, and it performed well enough to produce a sequel in 1958. But the more interesting consequence was visual. Suddenly the costume, the horse, the landscapes, everything people had been picturing in black and white on their television sets existed in full color. That changed the mental image of the mythology in ways that are hard to quantify but easy to feel. The movies don't get discussed much today, but they were a significant part of how the franchise's visual identity solidified during its peak years. Fact 2. The ending was never meant to be the ending. The series wrapped in 1957 after 8 seasons and 221 episodes. There was no finale, no final ride into the sunset, no ceremony, no closure for the millions of children who had spent nearly a decade watching this character. The show was canceled, not concluded, due to ongoing disputes between the production company and the network over costs and direction. The last episode aired like any other episode, and then it was just over. Clayton Moore found out the show was canceled the way most actors found out things in that era, through other people. Not from a phone call, not from a conversation, but through the industry grapevine. For a show that had helped save a network, defined a generation of children's television, and sustained a mythology across 8 years of weekly storytelling, the exit was shockingly quiet. That still stings a little when you sit with it. Fact 1. The Lone Ranger changed what television could be. Here's the fact that contains all the other facts. The Lone Ranger was a proof of concept. It proved that television could sustain ongoing, serialized storytelling for children week after week without losing its audience. It proved that a character with a genuine moral code, a written moral code, enforced across every medium, could hold that audience without compromising the code for ratings. It proved that genre entertainment could live on television just as powerfully as it lived in movie theaters. And it did all of this at the exact moment when television itself was still figuring out what it was and what it could do. The show didn't just survive the transition from radio to TV. It helped write the rules that television would follow for decades afterward. Every serialized children's show that came after it built on the foundation it laid. Every franchise with a moral code, a merchandise empire, and a loyal audience across multiple media. Every single one of those owes something to a masked man on a white horse who rode out of a Detroit radio station in 1933 and somehow never really left. So, which one got you? Because something on that list had to land differently than the rest. Was it the legal battle? The real-world inspiration? The fact that the most iconic theme in American TV history was written for a completely different country about a completely different cause? Drop it in the comments. I'm genuinely curious which one changed something for you. And if this brought back a memory you hadn't touched in years, good. That's the whole point.